Well, everybody, thanks to all the participants for the excellent conferences yesterday. Today, Professor Emmanuel Renault will give the opening lecture. Thank you, Professor Renault, for accepting our invitation and for coming here to Madrid. He's well known, but simply to give a brief biographical profile, Renault is a professor of philosophy in Paris at the University of Nanterre. Because of his career, he's one of the main theorists in France on Marx, critical theory, the discussions on social suffering and recognition. He's also published extensively on modern and contemporary philosophy, addressing authors such as Hegel and Dewey. In the last years, he authored books such as Marx and Philosophy, Reconnaissance, Conflit and Domination, Souffrance Sociale, and his latest book, from which our discussion today draws on, is Abolir l'exploitation, expérience, théorie et stratégie. Emmanuel, you have the floor.
Muchas gracias por la presentación, por los organizadores y organizadoras también. Me voy a cambiar el lenguaje. Because I use all the Spanish words that I know already. So my title is maybe a little bit mysterious. So what does it make? What difference does it make to think of work as exploited? I'm aware that this title is somehow paradoxical, for it could seem obvious that exploitation should be defined as exploitation of work. The meaning of this title will probably become less paradoxical if I clarify what I mean by work. By work here, I mean work as a working activity, or as concrete labor, if one uses Marx's terminology. Now, it is simply a fact that in the Marxist tradition, for instance, the very concept of exploitation is more often conceived of as a means to analyze work as abstract labor than as a means to analyze and criticize the capitalist organization of working activities. My title also intends to draw attention to the fact that in contemporary discussions, the analysis and criticism of neoliberal work organization and work conditions is more often articulated in terms of injustice at work, domination at work, or suffering at work, than in terms of exploitation of working activities. Hence, the twofold stake of my paper, the first dealing with the very definition of exploitation, and the other with the analysis and criticism of contemporary work organization and work conditions. Hence, also a twofold way of rephrasing my title. You get it on the screen. First, on the one hand, what difference it makes for the concept of exploitation to think of working activities as exploited, and second, what difference it makes for the criticism of neoliberal work organization and work conditions to think of working activities as exploited. In what follows, I will proceed in 3 steps. In the first step, I will analyze and criticize 2 ways of disconnecting exploitation and work as activity. That of the Marxist tradition, but not of Marx himself, and that of contemporary analytic philosophy of exploitation. In a second step, I will provide a critical examination of the disconnect between critique of neoliberal work organization and work conditions on the one hand, and critique of exploitation on the other. In a third step, I will elaborate a conception of exploitation where the criticism of exploited working activities plays a crucial role, and I will suggest that such a conception could play a useful role in the critique of contemporary neoliberal work organization and work condition, and I hope that this could be also useful in our discussion concerning precarity at the neoliberal age. So first, let me consider the first way of disconnecting exploitation and work as activity. So here, it becomes obvious that PowerPoints are better than Word files. Anyway, so for those who are familiar with the Marxist tradition or with critical theory, it probably seems obvious that exploitation should be thought of as exploitation of labor. But, as already said, it is also true that in the Marxist tradition, the concept of exploitation is usually connected to labor as abstract labor, rather than to labor as concrete labor. What matters in this tradition is to provide accurate explanation of the profit formation and to trace back the structural distributive inequalities and also structural domination between classes, to trace them back to the social relation of production that make it possible for a class to appropriate part of the value produced by the workers, considered of as member of subalterns groups. Therefore, the focus is on work as producing surplus value. Or in other words, the focus is on work on producing exchange value rather than use value. Work is conceived of as abstract labor producing exchange value or value, rather than work as concrete labor producing use value. The critical function of the concept of exploitation concerns the appropriation of surplus value rather than the effects of exploitative processes on the very working activity. Sometimes the reduction of work to abstract labor leads to a rejection of the critique of exploitation, such as in post-tone or in the Wertkritiker cycles. But even when the concept of exploitation is considered as one of the main tenets of Marx theory, it remains that a relative disconnect between exploitation and work as activity or as concrete labor is at play. In the analytic philosophy of exploitation, for instance, in Alan Wertheimer's book entitled Exploitation, one finds not only a relative disconnect between exploitation and work as activity, but an absolute disconnect. For instance, in this book, exploitation, and more generally in contemporary discussion in analytic philosophy of exploitation, and also in some discussion concerning analytic Marxist discussion. So exploitation is defined by the fact of benefiting of a relationship to another person at the expense of this other person. The key example is provided by a situation where someone is trapped in a pit, and this person trapped in a pit is obliged to pay a large amount of money to a person passing by. Okay. Should I go on?
Paramos un momento.
Yeah?
De todas formas, tiene que hacer caso bastante.
Vale.
Okay. So the key example illustrating this definition of exploitation, so as a relationship to another person at the expense of this person, in fact, benefiting of a relationship at the expense of the person with whom there is a relation. The key example is provided by a situation where someone is trapped in a pit and is obliged to pay a large amount of money to a person passing by that could help him to get out of the pit. It is striking, and so the person in the pit is exploited by the person passing by because he's obliged to accept the exploitative offer. It is striking that in such an example, the structural relationships of domination and the structural injustices doesn't play any roles. Just structural injustices between groups doesn't play any roles. It is also striking that in such an example, nobody's work. Neither the person passing by, neither the person trapped in the pit. In this sense, it can be said that there is not only a relative but an absolute disconnect between exploitation and work and activity. These relative or absolute disconnects between exploitation and working activities are indeed highly questionable. They are questionable from both an historical and a contemporary perspective. They are questionable from a historical perspective. First, since the issue of the effects of exploitative processes on the working activities was where the issue was deemed crucial in the first conceptualization of exploitation. Let me recall that the emergence of the socialist critique of exploitation must be traced back to Saint-Simonism, and more precisely to the 2 volumes of the exposition of the Saint-Simon doctrine, Exposition de Doctrine Saint-Simon. So you have here 2 references. So 1813, of course, and not 1813 and 1832. These texts provide the first occurrences of the very idea of the exploitation of man by man, exploitation de l'homme par l'homme. And then in these texts, one finds a general conception of history as a history of exploitation of man by man, humans by humans. And exploitation is also conceived of as one of the main problematic dimensions of the emerging capitalist society. These texts also set up the project of an abolition of exploitation of man by man, l'abolition de l'exploitation de l'homme par l'homme, a project that will be used in the following decades to define socialism. Let me also recall that the formula abolition of man by man became quickly very popular in the working class of the time, the emerging working class, as shown by the fact that this formula was one of the main motto of the 1848 revolution in France. Now, the reason why it became so quickly popular is partly, at least, that the Saint-Simonian critique of exploitation was also a critique of the effects of exploitative processes on the bodies and activities of the workers. This critique made sense to the workers and gave them the feeling that the notion of exploitation could help them to make sense of the condition of the working class they were experiencing. And it would also help them to make explicit what was at stake in their work experiences. For instance, the expressive force of the Saint-Simonian formula, abolition de l'exploitation de l'homme par l'homme, was also associated with the expressive force of other Saint-Simonian formula, such as the reference to the workers' sweat, la sueur des ouvriers. And these expressions with their expressive force have undoubtedly played a role in the spread of the formula and more generally in the use of the notion of exploitation throughout the working class at the time. In these Saint-Simonian writings, exploitation is conceived of as the exploitation of workers' sweat, that is, as an overload of work efforts and as a reduction of the working activity to mere means to increase profit at the expense of the workers' health. In a word, at the time of the emergence of critique of exploitation in the contemporary sense of the term, what was at stake was to criticize the effect of capitalist work organization on work as an activity, effects that amount to form of de-skillings and suffering at work, as well to various forms of health issues in a context of structural injustice and domination that seemed in full contradiction with the promises of the French Revolution. What matters for my argument is that this first socialist critique of capitalist exploitation was rooted in a description of the experience of exploitation as exploitation of concrete labor or as working activity. It is worth noting that such a connection with the experience of exploitation of concrete labor is still at play in Marx's account of exploitation in Das Kapital. The chapters, the working day, the division of labor in manufacture, and machinery and large-scale industry provide many descriptions of the effects of capitalist exploitative process on concrete labor. Marx clearly wants to connect his theory of the exploitative character of the capitalist modes of production, with a description of the experience of exploitation. And one can consider, as I try to show in my book, Abolir l'exploitation, that has been mentioned by Sergio, that the main concepts of Marx theory of values are intended to capture some dimension of experience of capitalist exploitation. They have also an expressive force in this sense. For instance, it's not difficult to hear some kind of an echo of the issue of the workers' sweat in the definition of abstract labor as expenditure of human labor power in the physiological sense at the end of section 2 of chapter 1 in Das Kapital. It is even easier to find echoes of the experience of the constraints to work always more, either more working hours or more intense working hours, or both. Not difficult to hear echoes of these constraints to work always more in the very concept of surplus labor. Isn't it significant that, according to Marx theory of value, the theory and critique of exploitation has to be elaborated from a twofold point of view, that of abstract labor and that of concrete labor, surplus value being always thought as connected to a surplus labor that is thought of both as abstract and concrete labor. I have just contended that the disconnect between exploitation and concrete labor can be criticized from both a historical and contemporary point of view. So far, I have only discussed this disconnect from a historical point of view, going back to Marx and Saint-Simonism. In order to discuss this disconnect from a contemporary point of view, I have to focus on a second disconnect between critique of neoliberal working conditions and critique of exploitation. I then come to the second part of this paper. So I come to the second disconnect. A striking feature of contemporary discussions in critical theory, in the broad sense of the term, is some kind of return of work in critical theory. This return of work in critical theory, where work is no longer reduced, there is a return of work in critical theory in which work is no longer reduced to employment or to work as source of distributive injustices through wages and profit appropriation. But more and more, work in this return of work in critical theory, so to say, is thought of as working activity. While the first decades of the neoliberal era gave rise to various theories of the end of work and to various theories of distributive injustice intended to counter the neoliberal exploitation of work-related distributive injustices. After this first shift in the discussion, the deepening of the neoliberal dynamics has resulted in a new focus on the effects of these dynamics on the work experience. The main concepts used to analyze these effects are those of suffering at work, but also, more recently, attempts have been made to think of domination at work, and not only to domination, to work-related domination, and also to injustice at work, and not only to work-related social injustices. For instance, injustices related to unemployment or to income inequalities, as I already mentioned. The main concept used to analyze the effects of the neoliberal So what is at stake in this with the use of such concepts, suffering at work, injustice and domination at work? It is to criticize some specificities of the neoliberal work organization. Neoliberal work organizations are intended to increase the productivity of the workers, notably through individualizing the worker activity and responsibility, and through creating competitions between workers. The search for short-term profit also results in a degradation of the working conditions. The concept of suffering at work captures one of the main results of these various dynamics. The experience of work is becoming less and less satisfying and more painful. Neoliberal work organization is also structured by new techniques of assessment through quantitative indicators, and it is also structured by new modes of prescriptions, such as total quality processes. And all this managerial innovation imply new modes of reward and recognition of the efforts made at work, and of the definition of the quality of working activity. All this result in new forms of injustices at work, and not only to new forms of work-related injustices. The fact that the issue of work-related injustice is no longer reduced to distributive injustices in terms of income, but also associated with the issue of the injustice of rewards and recognition at work is another striking shift of the contemporary discussion. The third concept that is often used to capture the neoliberal transformations of the work experience is that of domination. Neoliberalism is characterized by various forms of precarization of work, be it through a weakening of the labor laws and the bypassing of the legal and social protections associated with wage work, be it through the weakening of the work collectives, be it through the undermining of the social state and the social protections offered to the unemployed. All these forms of precarization result in an increased vulnerability to domination, as well as in new forms of domination. For instance, a new form of domination suffered by platform workers through algorithm, notably. One striking feature of this renewal interest in the critique of the working experience is that it hasn't been associated with a renewal of the criticism of exploited labor. There are probably many reasons for that. The most obvious reason is probably that the concept of exploitation seems outdated. It is simply a fact that in the academic sphere, exploitation is considered as an outdated concept, intrinsically associated with outdated ways of framing issues, such as the labor theory of value, such as a simplistic conception of social relationships of domination between classes, such as a monolithic conception of social domination. You know that a lot have been written to support these prejudices. But it is also a fact, and it's an interesting contrast for us as academics, I guess, but it is also a fact that the very notion of exploitation still belongs to the vocabulary of ordinary social criticism. Ordinary people remain convinced that in order to make sense and to criticize some work-related social problems, it is better to frame the issues in terms of exploitation rather than in other terms such as suffering at work, justice at work, or domination at work. For instance, it seems more natural, more accurate to address the issues of professional internships in terms of exploitation rather than in terms of suffering at work or injustice at work or domination at work, even if what is at stake, well, what is problematic in the experience of forced professional internship, so to say, is also suffering at work, injustice at work, and domination at work. It is therefore tempting to hypothesize that the concept of exploitation is able to fulfill some critical functions better than other critical concepts, such as suffering, injustice, or domination at work. In my book on exploitation, I have tried to show that this hypothesis is fully legitimate, not only because the very concept of exploitation is intended to disclose the structure of the social processes producing what can be criticized in terms of suffering, injustice, and domination, but also because this concept is able to capture the specificity of experiences of combined suffering, domination, and injustice at work. It is also tempting to hypothesize that some of the particularities of the work experience of the neoliberal age are better articulated or understood in terms of exploitation rather than with other terms. In order to decide whether this hypothesis is relevant or not, we first need to clarify the very notion of exploitation and the particularities of the experience of exploitation of the working activity. I said that it's interesting for us to be aware that there is a contrast between the academic, the prejudice prevailing in academic circles, according to which the notion of exploitation is outdated, the contrast between this prejudice and the fact that the notion is still of ordinary use. This is quite interesting because it shows, because of course this prejudice is to be explained by a political evolution. The fact that Marx and Marxism has become outdated. But what it means is that academic discussion is more deeply affected by political evolution than ordinary language and the common sense that is operating in ordinary social critique. While we academics in the academic sphere, we are convinced that we are more independent from the political evolutions than the ordinary people. This is an interesting paradox, in my opinion. Anyway, so I'm coming to the third part of this paper. In Marx, exploitation is defined in general as appropriation of surplus labor. So this is something that is quite important to keep in mind, because one of the ordinary reasons why Marx's theory of exploitation is rejected is that it is assumed that it presupposes a labor theory of value. But it is simply wrong, because Marx's definition of exploitation is not a definition of exploitation as appropriation of surplus value. And indeed, the concept of surplus value presupposes a labor theory of value, but the general definition is not in terms of appropriation of surplus value, but in terms of surplus labor. It's only in the capitalist societies that the appropriation of surplus labor takes the form of an appropriation of surplus value. So, exploitation is defined in general as appropriation of surplus labor. And this definition is indeed still relevant in capitalist mode of production, where the appropriation of surplus labor takes the form of an appropriation of surplus value. The very idea of appropriation of surplus labor implies that the worker have to spend more effort and to produce more than they would have to do. They would have to produce, or more effort than they would have to spend if exploitation was abolished. It also means that exploitation is defined as an appropriation of work efforts at the expense of the workers. On the one hand, their body and lives are damaged by this surplus of work effort. And on the other hand, since they get no real compensation for their, or reward for their efforts, this appropriation of surplus labor impoverish them while enriching those who appropriate these work efforts. Hence, we see that Marx's conception of exploitation has two sides. One concerning concrete labor or work efforts, and the other concerning structural injustice and domination. This appropriation of work effort presupposes structural injustices in the possession of means of production, presupposes the social relation of domination between classes, and reproduce them. And what is at stake in this domination is to be able to reproduce these injustices, being able to appropriate these work efforts. So, on the one hand, we have a reference to working efforts that is clearly a reference to concrete labor, not only but also, or to work as working activity. And on the other hand, we have a reference to an appropriation of work efforts by the one or the many ruling classes, and it presupposes class domination and production and reproduction of structural injustices in terms of injustices in the distribution of incomes and opportunities of well-being. There are indeed many other possible definitions of exploitation. For instance, it can be argued, and I'm not sure that it's really possible to counter this argument. It can be argued that it is no longer possible to think of the structural relation of domination, conditioning exploitation, only as class domination, as soon as the issue of exploitation of domestic labor is taken seriously. But the main critical functions of the concept of exploitation clearly depends on the just mentioned interconnection between structural domination and injustice, conditioning, exploitation, and reproduced by it on the one hand, and appropriation of work efforts of the work effort of the members of subaltern groups on the other hand. This interconnection is nicely articulated by Eric Olin Wright and his definition of exploitation in 3 criteria. And it is interesting to note that in this definition, the Marxian concept of exploitation is rephrased without any reference to surplus labor, surplus value, and even to class, even if Eric Olin Wright is clearly focusing here on class domination rather than on patriarchal exploitation or domestic exploitation or exploitation of domestic labor, and this can be criticized for this, but maybe it's a point for the discussion. So we have the definition on the screen. Exploitation is a complex and challenging concept. It is meant to designate a particular form of interdependence of the material interests of people, namely in situations that satisfy 3 criteria: the interdependent welfare principle. The material welfare of the exploiters causally depends upon the material deprivation of the exploited. This means that the interests of actors within such relation are not merely different, they are antagonists. The realization of the interests of exploiters imposes harms on the exploited. The exclusion principles is inverse interdependence of the welfare of the exploiters and exploited depends upon the exclusion of the exploited from access to certain productive resources. The appropriation principle, exclusion generates, or exclusion, the second principle, generate material advantage to the exploiters because it enables them to appropriate the labor efforts of the exploited. This definition in 3 criteria stresses that exploitation, especially capitalist exploitation, relies on an economic dependency due to the exclusion of some productive resources. Economic dependency makes it necessary for the subaltern groups to accept exploitative offers. And the fact that exploitation is grounded on an acceptance of exploitative offers rather than on violence is something that should be stressed, because it implies that exploitation often goes with consent. This definition also suggests that exploitation implies both injustice and domination, and so also consent to injustice and so consent to domination. Consent to injustice in the distribution of productive resources and in compensation of labor efforts. Consent to domination between social groups and also domination within the workplace. Since exploitation requires constraints to produce surplus labor in a form that is in conformity with the production of surplus value, and then it necessarily requires, in Foucauldian terms, discipline and punishment of the labor power. In other words, this definition in 3 criteria suggests that exploitation results in specific forms of experience of injustice and domination at work. In order to give flesh to this hypothesis, such a definition in 3 criteria is not enough indeed. What is required is an inquiry into the specificities of the domination act, of the experience of domination and injustice at work. Concerning domination at work, it could be useful to recall that according to Marx himself, the specificities of domination implied by exploitation are not only related to a wage contract conceived as a contract of obedience, but also to a power technology, denoted by the concept of fabric despotism, and to technological dispositives, since technical innovation is also used as a means of domination of the workers, according to Marx himself in Das Kapital. Another interesting aspect of Marx's account of the domination as a factor in exploitative process is that exploitation is giving power of resistance to workers instead of depriving them of any power of resistance. The simple fact that the production of surplus value is depending on the labor efforts of the worker gives them a power to undermine the process of production of surplus value. To undermine this process through restriction of production, through sabotage, okay, I don't know how to say in English, or through strikes. And so exploitation, giving rise to this type of resistances against exploitation, also give the worker give to the worker the opportunity to become aware of their social power when they engage themselves in such resistances, far from depending on a monolithic conception of domination. Marx's theory of exploitation implies a differentiated conception of domination at work and a focus on the capacity of the worker to resist this domination. Indeed, it would be wrong to believe that Marx's analysis of domination as a factor of exploitative processes could be simply applied without any reformulation or rectification to our neoliberal period. Neoliberalism is characterized by a multiplication of exploitative processes and of modes of domination playing a role in exploitative processes. The exploitation of platform workers, for instance, is freed from the type of subordination involved in the wage work relationships, and it is rooted in technological modes of domination through algorithm that Marx couldn't have imagined. Moreover, neo-managerial techniques provide illustration of a power dispositive that Marx couldn't have imagined. These examples suffice to show that Marx's theory of exploitation has to be revised to account for the neoliberal forms of exploitation. But these examples also show that it still makes sense to analyze the relationships between exploitation and domination from the threefold Marxian point of view, firstly from the point of view of the type of labor contract or commercial relation, secondly from the point of view of the power dispositives at play in the workplaces, and thirdly from the point of view of the technologies structuring the production process. In order to analyze the specificity of the injustice at work implied by exploitative processes, it is not really possible to draw on Marx, since he claimed that exploitation should be criticized in terms of domination rather than in terms of injustice. His theory of value and the methodological simplification implying that in a capitalist economy, exchanges are always exchanges of equivalent in value equivalent. These assumptions have made it impossible for him to take seriously the fact that the experience of exploitation is always that of an under-remuneration of a working activity. In order to clarify what is at stake in such an experience of under-remuneration, one has to disclose two types of normative expectations immanent to the working activity. Work is an activity of production, and as an activity of production, it is a contribution to the production of wealth. But work is also an activity which presupposes labor effort, as already said, and as such it is characterized by forms of hardships. These two dimensions of work, contribution on the one hand and hardships on the other, are decisive in the experience of exploitation as injustice, because each of these two dimensions can give rise to a distinct form of experience of injustice. The first form arises when the feeling emerges that one's contribution to the production of wealth is not properly rewarded, recognized, or remunerated. And we can call this the contributory injustice. The second form of experience of injustice arises when we feel that our efforts are not sufficiently compensated. And we can call this compensatory injustice. Being aware that we are condemned to work for others because of an unequal distribution of productive resources is not enough to produce a feeling of exploitation. Nor it is enough to become aware that inequalities in wages and wealth are reaching astronomical levels. For experiences of exploitation to occur, what is required is moreover either a feeling of disproportion between a wage or reward, generally, between a reward and the value of one's productive contribution, contributory injustice, or a feeling of disproportion between a wage or reward, more generally, and the nature of one's effort, compensatory injustice. An experience of distributive injustice may therefore be combined with an experience of contributory injustice or compensatory injustice to give rise to an experience of exploitation. And of course, these latter two experiences can themselves be combined in different ways. Conversely, feelings of contributory or compensatory injustice are not enough on their own to give rise to a feeling of exploitation. It is only when the experience of one of injustice, or to both of them, is accompanied by the feeling of working to one's own detriment and to the advantage of others. So we find here again the inverse independent welfare principle of economic grant. It is only when these two feelings of injustice are associated, so on the one hand, contributory or compensatory injustice and feeling of distributive injustice in the sense of inverse independent welfare principle, that a feeling of injustice is transformed or takes a specific form of an experience of exploitation. In other words, in addition to the experience of contributory injustice or compensatory injustice, the experience of distributive injustice is necessary for the experience of exploitation to exist. Experience of exploitation as contributory injustice and compensatory injustice are nonetheless decisive, and so here we see how what the reason why, even if we think of injustice at work or related at work, we say something more when we think of injustice in terms of exploitation than simply a specific form of economic injustice. Yeah, I'm concluding. These few remarks, and this is my conclusion, led me to my conclusion. Because they help to answer to the question raised by my title, what difference it makes to think of work as exploited. As a conclusion, let me point out that we have been led to answer that this difference is threefold. Firstly, thinking of work as exploited enables us to capture specific forms of experience of domination and injustice that are pervasive in the neoliberal work experience, but that are rarely considered when philosophers discuss the issue of domination at work. For instance, in debate about workplace democracy, we talked about that yesterday, or when they discuss the issue of justice at work. Discussions that is often focused on work-related distributive injustice or on injustice in recognition at work, but this remains a restricted way of framing the issue. Secondly, thinking of work as exploited helps us thinking the combination of various types of experience of injustice and domination, various types of injustice and dominations that are often combined in the very experience of exploitation. In other words, it helps us making sense of the work experience in the neoliberal age, notably, and of some of its most problematic dimensions for the workers themselves. Some of these most problematic dimensions being precisely related to a combination of feelings of injustice with feeling of being condemned to domination by economic dependency. And this is this dimension of consent, forced consent, because of an economic dependency that is a very specific feature also of the experience of exploitation and of the feelings of domination and injustice that are associated to it. Thirdly, thinking of work as exploited helps us connecting the description of the experience of domination and injustice with an analysis of the specificities of the exploitative process of the neoliberal age. I don't have enough time to provide an extended description of such specificity, but let me refer once again to Marx's concept. And let me claim that at the neoliberal age, the dynamics of production of surplus value tend to transform itself. We can speak of a shift of the dynamic of production of relative surplus value that tends to be replaced by a dynamic of production of absolute surplus value, that is, with intensification of work, extension of the working day, blurring of the divide between the working and private life that result in new dynamics of colonization of private life, not only as life of the consumer, but also as life of the producer. And of course, we could also refer to the postponement of the retirement age to find another illustration of a dynamic of absolute surplus value production. And indeed, one should also complement Marx's analysis, for instance, in pointing out that the very notion of precarization describes some of the specificities of the neoliberal dynamic of production of absolute surplus value. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Emmanuel. There's a clear common ground between your presentation and